Regrowth in Barren Soil. Written and read by Elton Gar. The ancient cargo ship shuddered as it struggled against the gravity of the world. There were grinding sounds as it scraped across the hard surface. This world had been carefully picked because they hoped its inhabitability would mean no one else would want it. The only plants in sight were struggling to survive along the edge of a large lake that, they hoped, would allow them to survive. Captain Hines wasn't convinced it would, but she also didn't really care. She had lost everything that made her life worth fighting for in the war. Now the only thing left for her was getting these people here, and that was done. She didn't leave the ship or even get out of her chair. She simply went through the slow process of turning the old cargo ship off, first opening the cargo ramp on the bottom of the ship, and then shutting down the engines, and finally the life support, leaving only the dim emergency lighting. Using the ship as the core of the colony was appealing, but a giant metal box on a hot planet wouldn't be a good solution, and they couldn't run the ship all the time. It didn't even have the fuel to get to another system. The plan was to use the inedible parts of the plants they grew as fuel to recharge the ship, and, eventually, refill its tanks. But that would take several seasons of good harvests. By the time that Catherine Hines got up and made her way through the dim halls of the cargo ship, it was almost entirely empty. She saw one of the two engineers moving through the ship, preparing it to sit empty for what could be years. The warm air struck her as she reached the cargo hold where she saw people moving things out of the ship. There were already half a dozen tents set up, big enough for 10 or 12 people, so long as they didn't want to move around too much, as well as a much larger canopy with most of their boxes under it. Everyone was doing something, though if there was any organization to it, she couldn't see what it was. After a few minutes of watching, she found one of the 10-gallon plastic buckets filled with water and sat on it. Officially, she was a guest of the colony now that she had done her job. She would be paid over the next 2 or 3 years in food by the colony. The sun went down fairly quickly, and since there were only half a dozen lights set up, people began to go to sleep. But just as she was considering where she might sleep, a small group of people took out instruments and gathered around one of the lights. She tried to ignore the music. Vance would have been more interested in music than her, but even if he was here, this wasn't the type of music he would have enjoyed. It had a folksiness to it that she tried to dislike, but there was a joy in it as well, a joy that didn't match the tiny moon and dark gray landscape around them. After a half hour, she found herself at the edge of the circle. People made way for her, and she sat down on a chair someone had unbolted and brought out from the cargo ship. Bringing out the chair made sense, and it wasn't like it was her ship, but someone still should have asked. They played through most of the night, but as the people playing got tired, the crowd began to thin. There would be plenty to do tomorrow, but Catherine was probably being more useful helping to keep watch than she would be in the morning. "It's good to see you joining in," Mother Lila said. She was one of the oldest people on the trip. They simply couldn't afford to have many people who didn't contribute directly to survival. But she had been a teacher for almost 35 years, and no one wanted their children to go without an education. And she didn't limit her teaching to children. "It was that or sit alone in the dark," Catherine said. "And it's good to see you chose to join in," Lila said, and she stood up. Catherine could almost hear the old bones creak as she did. She was fairly certain she had missed something, but it was late and she was tired, so she found a mattress that seemed abandoned. After waiting a couple of minutes to make sure no one else was coming to get it, she pulled it next to a large rock, rolled up her jacket for a pillow, and fell asleep. She woke up the next morning in shadows. She assumed, for a moment, that she had, by some luck, picked the right side of the stone to sleep on to avoid the morning sun. But when she looked around, she discovered that someone had hung up a tarp so that it protected her from the sun. It wasn't put up well, with only one pole, but the rest was sitting nearby. So she decided it wasn't incompetence, it was a desire to not wake her up. Whatever it was, she appreciated it. She glanced at her jacket, but decided that perhaps she didn't need it. It was a sign of authority, but it was an authority that she no longer had, and it wasn't designed for the hot, dry world they were on. It was designed for the climate-controlled environment of a starship. So she took a moment and set the tarp up better, then hung the jacket over the front like a makeshift door. It was still just a mattress in the ground, but it would do for home. She expected to see the colonists working to improve the luxuries of their makeshift camp. There was more than enough stone to build homes, and she had seen them study in the homes of ancient people. What she found were two groups. The smaller was cooking, and the smell of coffee drew her in. A boy, too young to be doing harder labor, handed her a cup of coffee without having to say anything. There was nothing to put into it. Even the coffee itself was a luxury that wouldn't last, but there wasn't much point in keeping it in reserve. The powdered food was bland. Evidently, keeping their spices in reserve had more value than coffee. She ate quietly, sitting in one of the ship's chairs as she watched the other group. They were attacking a large section of dried earth with anything they could find. The larger men were breaking the soil into chunks, and others broke those into smaller pieces, while the rocks, of which there were plenty, were put into a variety of piles. "It's a beautiful world, isn't it?" Mother Lila said, moving next to Captain Hines without saying hello. "It's a dead heap," the captain answered. She tried to be more positive with the others, but Mother Lila wasn't some fragile flower that needed protecting. She understood that if this colony survived at all, it would be just surviving, and not much else. "Exactly. Nothing but potential. Imagine how beautiful that field will be to the people who know that they brought it to life." Catherine's father had believed in hard work, and he had followed through with that belief. He was the one who had earned enough to get her into school, but in the end, the work had killed him, at least indirectly. He had been the manager of a factory by then, having worked his way up. That meant he could have stayed home on the day when the bombs came. A lot of managers had, but he had been there with the rest of them, creating weapons that would be used against workers in other factories. Sure, assuming anything grows, there was a lot of damage done to this world, Catherine said. "Things are more resilient than we think. All they need is sunlight, water, and time," Lila said. This time, Catherine understood what Mother Lila was saying. She should have caught it the night before, but she had been tired. "I'm not one of your students. I did my job. I got you here. That was what was left." "Of course it was, and no one needs you to do anything else. But if you get bored, there's a group of people working on setting up a mushroom farm." "Not a big mushroom fan," Catherine said. She had always found they somehow tasted both dirty and slimy at the same time. "You don't have to love them, but they grow fast, and it's a good way to recycle all the trash that can't be used for other things," Mother Lila said. "I'll think about it," Catherine said. "That's more than I had hoped." Lila took a long sip of her coffee. An hour later, sitting in the shade watching other people work had become hard enough that Catherine made her way to the small cave where the mushroom farm was being made. That's when she figured out why they had coffee that morning. The grounds, along with a lot of other trash from the ship, had been brought here and were being mixed up with the dirt that other people outside were digging up. It was disgusting, but the pool of water at the bottom of the small cave kept it cooler in here, and the work of mixing the soil was quiet and reminded Catherine of her mother and her victory gardens. She had started one before the war, growing things that could be canned and filling their shells with it. That would have helped more if she hadn't given away so much when the fighting started. But Catherine hadn't been in the position to tell her mother to reserve her resources. She had spent most of the war on various ships, gathering needed resources, and eating better than her parents on their best day. And, in the end, it hadn't been the lack of food that had got to her mother. It had been an enemy insurgency, a few hundred men who had slipped behind enemy lines, intending to do as much damage as possible. It hadn't meant a lot to the war effort, just one more small town that couldn't supply anything useful to the war effort. But a handful of civilians had died in the town's defense, and that had changed the war for Catherine. She didn't like to think about that, about the growing hatred she had for people who had mothers and fathers of their own, so she focused on the mushrooms. A woman showed her how to spread the spores over the soil that they mixed. Over the next few weeks, she was surprised that everyone had just moved on. They had filled the small cave with everything they could, and then focused on other work. But from time to time she visited. It was still dark, and it still smelled bad, but it was alive and growing, and even if she didn't like mushrooms, she thought she might try them. The other farm wasn't as quick, or as impressive. In fact, it hardly looked like a farm at all. There were no long rows of plants, just small shallow ditches and small crescent shapes with piles of rock on one side. The center of most of those were small shrubs or trees that looked nearly as dead as those that struggled to survive on the edge of the lake. But the colonists still stubbornly poured water onto them every day. Almost exactly 6 weeks after they had arrived, there was a celebration. They had their first harvest of mushrooms. It was small, as were the mushrooms, but they would continue to grow, and helped stretch out the dwindling supplies. Mother Lila broke away from the small group of children who never seemed to run out of energy, no matter how many hours of work and school they did. She walked over to Catherine and said, "It's good to see life coming back." "It's just mushrooms. They'll grow anywhere," Catherine said. "Walk with me," Mother Lila said, and put an arm out for Catherine to take it. The old woman could walk on her own. She wasn't as fragile as she often looked, but it felt rude not to take her arm, so she took it. Lila moved towards the lake as the sound of singing from the edge of the cave faded into the background. It still wasn't the type of music that Catherine liked, but she had to admit that it was better than nothing most of the time. They reached the farms after about 5 minutes of silence. That was twice as long as it would take most people, but the old woman showed no signs of caring. She stopped at one of the small half-circles and said, "You know, they planned the celebration before they arrived." "I didn't," Catherine said, but she thought she understood. The colonists had almost 2 months in the slow, old cargo ship, so they had planned out a lot. "Yeah, life is funny that way. It's all different, but it's all sort of the same, too." They knew that if they planted mushrooms, they'd have a harvest in 6 weeks, and they knew everyone would need something to celebrate. Catherine tried not to be annoyed by the obvious point that the woman was making, but the celebration had helped her mood, and over the last few weeks she had stopped spending so much of her time looking at the old cargo ship and wondering when they could begin to fuel it so she could get back to doing her job. "I still don't like mushrooms," Catherine said, though she'd eaten one of them, just like everyone else. It was probably only 30 or 40 calories, but it was the first thing that hadn't come out of their limited reserves. "Sure, that's why I wanted to bring you out here," Lila said. "To a bunch of empty ditches with dying trees at their center," Catherine said. "Perhaps not as empty as it might seem, if you actually pay attention," Lila said. Looking again, Catherine saw something. A few small bits of green among the rock and dirt. There were perhaps 6 or 8 of them, spread out more than she might have expected. Probably the rest hadn't survived. "It won't be a large harvest," she said. "First harvests often aren't. You're not just growing plants, you're changing the land that it grows in. And look at those trees. They don't do well alone, so these will grow first, but they have companion trees who will help. They'll hold the soil, give them shade, and they might even cross-pollinate if they're lucky. And when the companion plant dies, the entire thing collapses," Catherine said, not feeling in the mood for any of this. "Or the farmer plants more," Lila said. The old woman left her alone then, walking back to the party faster than when she had been holding on to Catherine, and the captain stood there for a few minutes watching the plants. Then she sat at one of the ugly stone walls they had made and watched the reflection of the sun setting over the lake. Over the next few weeks and months there were more celebrations. The first of their plants, small heads of lettuce and herbs, began to be picked after another 6 weeks, and while they didn't have many calories, they made the food a lot better. A couple of months after that, Catherine sat down next to Lila with a plate full of the first meal grown on this world. It was a small potato, a couple of mushrooms, some legumes, and a few other small things. She poked at the still hot potato with her fork and said, "It's not a lot of calories, but I think I could get used to this. Yes, things are coming along nicely, but I'm looking forward to when the trees bear fruit." "Won't that take years?" Catherine asked. "Everything happens in its own time. And yes, it may take years, but what else are we going to do?" One of the young boys, a young man who might never know another world other than this one, came over to see Lila. She knew all the children well, but instead of her, the young, dirty, sticky child climbed onto Catherine's lap and leaned against her. "We could always get into the ship and run away from it all," Catherine said, and she moved her hand to the boy's back, just to make sure he didn't fall. "Sure, but only after you've grown enough for the fuel," Lila said. Catherine picked up a mushroom. It wasn't as slimy or dirty as she remembered. It was almost crisp when done right, and she looked over the few dozen small circles that were growing, and then at the vast empty barrens that surround them, and said, "It really is a beautiful world." Author's note: the metaphor for this story might have been a bit too obvious, or perhaps I'm a bit too obtuse in my other stories, but either way, the story was easier to write than normal, and it made me feel better as I went. I also think it's more connected to this month's theme of faith, hope, and love than many of the other stories I've written. If anyone is interested in the farming, and why wouldn't you be, I suggest you look up The Great Green Wall. It might be one of the most interesting projects in the world. and it's a lot more practical than building a megacity in a long line. It's allowing for people to reclaim or hold back the land that would otherwise be taken over by deserts, and while it might look strange to those who are used to more traditional farming, it's really quite beautiful when you see it. As for the aforementioned metaphor, I hope none of you have been as barren as Catherine Hines, but I know that there are people who have faced a lot of pain and a lot of loss. But things regrow given time. They won't be the same. The harvest may not be as large as you want, and perhaps all you'll get is mushrooms for a while. But things get better. Seasons come and go, and the fruit comes eventually. So hold on to hope, and keep going for another day. If you want more stories like this one, then you can sign up for my newsletter at scifi.com. Every week I share prose versions of my stories and my thoughts on life, the universe, and sci-fi. Or you can visit my Patreon. Free members get access to many short stories and can vote on my monthly theme poll. And if you're in a season of harvest and can afford it, my paid patrons get access to over 50 patron-exclusive short stories, as well as my gratitude. Thank you. Elton Gar.